Alright, let's do a few exercises that will help you get acclimated to the medium. The first thing we're going to do is create a value scale. So, on the side of your board, mark off a 2-inch border. Let's use the white pencil to do that. Okay, so we're going to have a pure white value here, and then gradually, little by little, we're going to go darker and darker and darker. In order to create a simple value scale like this, we're going to use a technique called wet into wet. So I've got my palette here. By the way, if you are using a stay wet palette, do not forget to activate your paper. So you want to take the palette paper and soak it in really hot water for about 10 to 15 minutes until it goes semi-transparent. The sponge underneath should be really wet, but not so wet that it pools water onto the actual palette. Right? That's really, really important. You don't want your palette to have little pools of water in it. All right. Now we're going to squeeze paint on the sides of the palette. By the way, always put paint on the corners of the palette, never in the middle. On a palette this small, you want to make sure to leave as much mixing area in the center as possible and keep your paints on the side. All right, wet into wet is a really simple technique. So long as the paint is wet, it's going to blend, not by itself, but pretty easily. The problem is that the paint dries really quickly on the painting surface, which means that I don't have a lot of time to mix up values as I'm painting. So the key to wet into wet is to pre-mix a bunch of values that will make the painting process go really fast. It's also really important to have your board primed correctly, because if you have one thin prime or the prime isn't effective, then the water gets sucked out of the paint really quickly, and then you're not going to be able to do the blending. Okay, so make sure you've got 3 coats, honor system. And then we're going to pre-mix a bunch of values. Okay, so let's start off by mixing. We already have white, we don't need to do that. We're going to pre-mix a light gray. Okay, that's going to be my light gray. Now let's go a little bit darker. We want to mix up, I think, probably about 5 different values. Okay, so this is going to be kind of mid-tony gray. Then we're going to go a little bit darker. Darker still. Let's do one more. That's going to be really dark gray. Pre-mix a little bit more paint than you think you're going to use, because you really don't know how much paint you're going to need until you really start painting. Okay, I think that's going to be good. Okay, I've got my water over here. Okay. Provided that I've mixed my values correctly, this should be a fairly fast process. I've got my white. I always start off with a white, by the way. You can start with a black, but I think it's easier to start off with a white. Okay, so can you guys see this? Yeah. Okay, so white's going to go over here. That is very transparent. Let me mix up a slightly denser white, slightly more opaque white. Okay. So, white over here, like this. Then you're going to clean off your brush a little bit and put down the lighter gray right next to it, and then just tickle back and forth a little bit. Right? The paint's going to blend by itself. Let's go darker. Just work back and forth, and you'll get a blend. Right? Let's go darker still. Put it down. So we should be close to mid-tone right about here. You see this kind of matches the value of the board. Okay. And pure black. Again, the reason why it's really important to have your surface primed is primarily for doing this kind of wet into wet technique, right? It's going to keep the paint from getting absorbed in the surface and allow you to move it around. Okay, now there might be some areas that go a little bit transparent, a little bit streaky. We need to kind of wait until this dries before we really take a look at it, but this is wet into wet blending. When do you use wet into wet? As much as possible. Whenever you've got some kind of big value transition, so let's say a sky. Skies are usually darker towards the top and then lighter towards the horizon. We're going to use this kind of big wet into wet application to create the blend. At the beginning of a painting, to block in general transitions, we're going to use wet into wet. The problem with wet into wet is that you have to work fairly quickly, and it's hard to put in details, hard to make adjustments while you're working wet into wet. So it's a technique that, again, is used for simple stuff, for big areas. For smaller areas, we need to use two other kinds of blending techniques. One is called wet into dry, and another one is called dry brush. So let's talk about those two blending techniques. Near your value scale somewhere, I want you to mark off, what was I using here? I think I was using the lighter pencil. Okay. Draw 4 little squares like this. Let's see. Okay, that should be fine. Okay. So the second blending technique I'm going to show you is called wet into dry. This is actually the most common technique for detail, for finishing your painting. It's going to look like this. Start off with a value, just looking for my brush here. Sorry, you can't see outside my camera, but it's a disaster. There's a lot of stuff laying around, a lot of materials. Ah, my brush is right here. Okay. All right. Let's start off with a value that's a little bit lighter than your ground surface, like this. Okay, I've got my paper towel ready. Okay. Paint in that little square like this. And now I have to work quickly. Before this little square dries, I'm going to clean off my brush a little bit, dab it off on the paper towel so I've got kind of a damp brush, not a soaking wet brush, and then you're going to run along the edge of your paint like this. So we're running basically water along the edge, and we're diluting the acrylic paint. We're making it thinner along the edges. As you dilute the paint becomes what? It becomes transparent. More and more of the ground color shows through, and what we're doing is blending optically. Does that make sense? Here we're blending physical pigments together to create value. Here we're diluting the paint, almost like watercolor, to create a transition. Yeah, we can see a little bit of the pencil mark coming through, but that's the idea behind wet into wet. Let me do this with a smaller brush. That's going to give me a little bit more control. Let's do that. Okay. So now I'm going to mix up a value that's a little bit darker than my tone, my ground color. That's the same value. No good. Okay. Okay, so it's going to be a little bit darker than my ground color. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to clean off my brush. You guys see me cleaning off my brush? Good, all right. Now I'm going to run a little bit of water and basically tickle the edges a little bit. Okay, this smaller brush is going to give me a little more control and create a little more of an even blend. Let's do that again. Okay, got it. Oh, this is reflecting a lot. Let me just show you what's going on here so you guys can see that. Ah, okay. Do you see the soft transition here? Hope you can. Okay. So, is this dry yet? Yeah. Okay. So this is wet into wet. Wet into wet. This is called wet into dry. Wet into dry. There's one additional way to blend, and that is called dry brushing. Now, dry brushing involves putting down a value and then scraping the edges of the paint onto the ground color. As you scrape the paint becomes sort of more transparent looking and creates a sense of blending. So, well, we'll see what this looks like. But basically, if you look at the painting surface under a microscope, you're going to see that it's composed of a bunch of dips and ridges, right? When the paint gets really sticky, it no longer goes into the dips, it just stays on the ridges like this, right? The more you scrape, the more of the paint color underneath you can see, which creates the impression, the illusion that there's a blend. All right, so in this case, we're going to do something a little bit unusual. You're going to mix up a lighter value as you normally would. So we're going to paint a square a lighter value, like this. And now I'm going to dry my brush. So this is why the paper towel is so important. Dry your brush like this, just squeeze it. So it should be dry, it should still have a little bit of paint on it. And then you're going to hold your brush sideways like this, and you're going to scrape. Remember I was telling you guys that acrylic has a tendency to destroy brushes? This is mostly because of the dry brush technique. Right? We're really scraping. Normally when I use this technique, I'll use my older brushes for this. So again, what's happening is I'm scraping the paint. The paint is kind of tacky, semi-dry, over this slightly rough surface, and it's creating dry brush. This is probably the easiest way to create blends in acrylic. Just recognizing it gives you a different look. So depending on how rough your painting surface is, sometimes the dry brush is going to be more or less visible. Sometimes it creates kind of a grainy, textured surface when you dry brush. So if you guys can see this. Yeah, there you go. It's kind of, okay, the paint's still wet. Right? You see how it's creating a soft transition? Okay. So that's dry brushing. Now let's practice doing that, but on a darker value. Again, dry off your brush, bang, and then scrape. Okay, dry brushing. Wet into dry. These two guys are dry brush. Okay, so before we start painting an image, I want all of you to practice these three blending methods. Guys, acrylic has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of acrylic is that it dries really quickly, which is why it's often used in illustration and other quick techniques, because, you know, particularly illustration, right, has really fast deadlines. You don't want to wait for hours and hours for your paint to dry before you touch it up again. So it dries really quickly, which allows you to create and finish a painting all in one day. You can pull off an all-nighter and finish a work of art. acrylic also has disadvantages, and the disadvantage is that it dries really quickly. The reason why it's a disadvantage is because it's difficult to create these kind of soft transitions without practice. So I want all of us to overcome that difficulty, or start overcoming that disadvantage, by practicing our blending techniques. Once you get the hang of them, acrylic is really, I don't know, my focus is going in and out. Acrylic becomes really easy to handle. If you don't master these blending techniques, then painting realistically, painting to try to create some kind of convincing sense of depth, form, becomes kind of complicated, because that involves creating soft transitions. So let's practice these techniques, and once we get used to them, then we'll try our hand at painting something, painting an actual image.